Hi, I hope that you're enjoying your Christmas break. I thought that I would share a little Christmas story with you that I love. Um, just snuggle up, get a blanket, snuggle up, and let's read The Christmas Miracle of Jonathan Toomey. The village children called him Mr. Gloomy, but in fact his name was Toomey, Mr. Jonathan Toomey. And though it's not kind to call people's names, this one kind of fit him pretty well. For Jonathan Toomey seldom smiled, and he never laughed, and he went about mumbling and grumbling and muttering and sputtering and grumping and griping. He complained that the church bells rang too often, and that the birds sang too shrilly, and that the children played too loudly. Now, Mr. Toomey was a wood carver. Some said that he was the best wood carver in the whole valley. He spent his days sitting at a workbench, carving beautiful shapes from blocks of pine and hickory and chestnut wood. After supper, he sat in a straight-backed chair near the fireplace, smoking his pipe and staring into the flames. Now, Jonathan Toomey wasn't an old man, but if you saw him, you might think he was. The way he walked bent forward with his head down, you wouldn't notice his eyes. They were the clear blue of an August sky. And you wouldn't see the dimple in his chin, since his face was mostly hidden under a shaggy, untrimmed beard, speckled with sawdust and wood shavings. And depending on what he ate that day, with crumbs of bread or bits of potato or dried gravy. Ew. The village people didn't know it, but there was a reason for his gloom, a reason for his grumbling, a reason why he walked hunched over, as if carrying a great weight on his shoulders. Some years earlier, when Jonathan Toomey was young and full of life and full of love, his wife and baby had become very sick. And because those were the days before hospitals and medicines and skilled doctors, his wife and his baby had died 3 days apart from each other. So Jonathan Toomey packed up his belongings into a wagon and traveled until his tears stopped, and he settled into a tiny house at the edge of a village to do his wood carving. One day in early December, there was a knock at Jonathan's door. Mumbling and grumbling, he went to answer it, and there stood a woman and a young boy. "I am the widow McDowell. I am new to your village, and this is my son, Thomas," the woman said. "I'm 7 and I know how to whistle," said Thomas. "Whistling is pish-posh," the woodcarver gruffly said. "I need something to be carved," said the woman, and she told Jonathan about a special set of Christmas figures her grandfather had carved for her when she was a girl. "After I moved here, I discovered that they were lost," she explained. "I had hoped that by some miracle I would find them again, but it hasn't happened." "There's no such thing as miracles," the woodcarver told her. "Now, can you describe the figures for me?" "There were sheep," she told him. "Yes, 2 of them, with curly wool," added Thomas. "Yes, 2, said the widow, "and a cow, an angel, Mary, Joseph, the baby Jesus, and the wise men." "3 of them," added Thomas. "Will you take the job?" asked the widow McDowell. "I will." "I'm so grateful. How soon can you have them ready?" "They'll be ready when they're ready," he said. "But I must have them by Christmas. They mean very much to me. I can't remember a Christmas without them." "Christmas is pish-posh," said Jonathan gruffly, and he shut the door. The following week, there was a knock at the woodcarver's door. Muttering and sputtering, he went to answer it, and there stood the widow McDowell and Thomas. "Excuse me," said the widow, "but Thomas has been begging to come and watch you work. He says he wants to be a woodcarver when he grows up and would like to watch you since you're the best in the valley." "I'll be quiet. You won't even know I'm here. Please, please, please," piped in Thomas. With a grumble, the woodcarver stepped aside and let them in. and he pointed to a stool near his workbench. No talking, no jiggling, no noise, he ordered Thomas. The widow McDowell handed Mr. Toomey a warm loaf of cornbread as a token of thanks, and she took her knitting and sat down in a rocking chair at the far corner of the cottage. Not there, bellowed the woodcarver. No one sits in that chair. So she moved to the straight-back chair by the fire. Thomas was very still. Once, when he needed to sneeze, he pressed his finger under his nose to hold it back. Once, when he desperately wanted to scratch his leg, he counted to 20 to keep his mind off the itch. And after a very long time, Thomas cleared his throat and whispered, Mr. Toomey, can I ask you a question? The woodcarver glared at Thomas and then shrugged his shoulder and grunted. So Thomas decided that meant yes, so he went on. Is that my sheep you're carving? The woodcarver grunted and nodded. And after another long time, Thomas whispered, Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but you're carving my sheep wrong. The widow McDowell's knitting needles stopped clicking, and Jonathan Toomey's knife stopped carving, and Thomas went on. It's a very beautiful sheep, nice and curly, but my sheep looked happy. Well, that's pish-posh, said Mr. Toomey. Sheep are sheep. They can't look happy. Well, mine did, answered Thomas. They knew that they were with the baby Jesus, so they were happy. After that, Thomas was quiet for the rest of the afternoon, and when the church bells chimed at 6 o'clock, Mr. Toomey grumbled under his breath, "Ugh, that awful noise!" And the widow McDowell said, "It's time to leave." And Thomas sneezed 3 times and thanked the woodcarver for allowing him to watch. That evening, after a supper of cornbread and boiled potatoes, the woodcarver sat down at his bench, and he picked up his knife, and he picked up the sheep, and he worked until his eyelids drooped shut. A few days later, there was another knock at the woodcarver's door. Griping and grumbling, he went to answer it, and there stood the widow and her son. "May I watch again? I promise I will be quiet," said Thomas. He settled himself on the stool very quietly, while his mother laid a basket of sweet-smelling raisin buns on the table. "The teapot's warm," Mr. Toomey said gruffly, and his head bent over his work. While Mr. Toomey carved, the widow McDowell poured tea. She touched the woodcarver gently on the shoulder and placed a cup of tea and a bun next to him. He pretended not to notice, but soon both the plate and the cup were empty. Thomas tried to eat the bun his mother had given him as quietly as he could, but it's almost impossible to be 7 and eat a warm, sticky raisin bun without making some smacking and licking and satisfied noises. When Thomas had finished, he tried to sit quietly. Once he almost hiccuped, but he took a deep breath and he held it in until his face turned red. And once, without thinking, he tried to swing his legs, but the glare from the woodcarver stopped him, and he kept them so still that his leg fell asleep. After a very long time, Thomas whispered, "Mr. Toomey, may I ask you a question?" "Is that my cow you're carving?" A nod. Another very long time went by, and Thomas cleared his throat. Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but I must tell you something. That is a very beautiful cow. I'm the most beautiful cow I've ever seen, but it's not right. You see, my cow looked proud." "Well, that's just pish-posh," growled the woodcarver. "Cows are cows. They cannot look proud." "Well, my cow did. It knew that Jesus chose to be born in its barn, so it was proud." Thomas was quiet the rest of the afternoon, and the only sounds that could be heard were the scraping of the carving knife, the humming of the widow McDowell, and the click-clack of her knitting needles. When the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Mr. Toomey muttered under his breath about the noise, and the widow McDowell said it was time to leave. Thomas first shook his leg out and then the other leg because they had fallen asleep, and he thanked the woodcarver for allowing him to watch. That evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes and raisin buns, the woodcarver sat down at his bench. He picked up his carving knife, and he picked up the cow, and he worked until his eyelids drooped closed. A few days later, there was another knock at the woodcarver's door. He smoothed his hair and went to answer it, and at the door was the widow and her son. "May I please watch you again?" said Thomas. As Mrs. McDowell warmed the tea and put a plate of fresh molasses cookies on the workbench, Thomas watched the woodcarver work on a figure of an angel. After a very long time, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, but is that my angel you're carving?"
"Yes, and would you do me the favor of telling me exactly what I'm doing wrong?"
"Well, my angel looked like one of God's most important angels because he was sent to baby Jesus."
"And just how does someone make an angel look important?" said the woodcarver.
"You'll be able to do it," said Thomas. "You are the best woodcarver in the valley." After a very long time, Thomas spoke again. "Mr. Toomey, excuse me, may I ask you another question?"
"Do you ever stop talking?" said the woodcarver.
"My mother says I don't. She says I could learn a lot about the virtue of silence from you." Under his beard, the woodcarver's face turned pink, and the widow McDowell's face turned as red as the scarf she was knitting.
"Well, speak up. What's your question?"
Thomas said, "Will you please teach me to carve?"
"I'm a very busy man," grumbled the woodcarver.
But he put down the very important angel.
"You will carve a bird," he said.
"Ooh, a robin, I hope," said Thomas. "I like robins." With a piece of charcoal, the woodcarver sketched out a robin on a piece of brown paper, and he handed Thomas a small block of pine and a knife, and he showed him how to lop the corners off the block and slowly smooth the edges of the wood into curves. Thomas copied the woodcarver's strokes, head bent, tongue working from side to side as his lower lip as he concentrated. And when the church bells chimed 6 o'clock, Jonathan Toomey was holding Thomas's hand in his, guiding the knife along the edge of the wing. He didn't even hear them ringing. The widow McDowell said it was time to leave. So Thomas brushed the wood shavings from his shirt, and he reached out and brushed 2 especially large pieces of wood shavings from Jonathan Toomey's beard. He thanked the woodcarver for teaching him how to carve. And later, after a supper of boiled potatoes and molasses cookies, Jonathan Toomey went to his workbench. He thought for a long, long time. He sketched drawing after drawing. Finally, he picked up his carving knife, and he picked up the angel, and he carved until his eyelids drooped shut. A few days later, there was a knock at the woodcarver's door. Mr. Toomey jumped up and answered it, and there at the window was the widow McDowell with a bouquet of pine boughs and holly sprigs dotted with berries, and there stood Thomas clutching his partly carved robin. While Thomas and Mr. Toomey carved, Mrs. McDowell put the bouquet in a jar of water, and she scrubbed Mr. Toomey's kitchen table and set the jar in the center on a pretty cloth embroidered with lily of the valley and daisies, which she found in a drawer below the cupboard.
"Next, I'm going to carve the wise men and Joseph," the woodcarver said to Thomas. "Perhaps before I begin, you better tell me about all the mistakes I'm going to make."
"Well," said Thomas, "my wise men were wearing the most wonderful robes because they were going to visit Jesus. And my Joseph, he was leaning over baby Jesus like he was protecting him, and he looked very serious." It wasn't until the church bells chimed and the widow and her son were preparing to go that Mr. Toomey saw the jar of pine boughs and the scrubbed table and the cloth embroidered with lily of the valley and daisies. I found the cloth in a drawer. I thought it would look pretty on the table, the widow McDowell said, smiling.
Never open that drawer, the woodcarver said harshly.
When the two had left, Jonathan put the cloth away, and that evening, after a supper of boiled potatoes, the woodcarver worked on Joseph and the wise men until his eyes drooped shut. A few days later, there was a knock on the woodcarver's door. He dusted the crumbs from his beard, and he brushed the sawdust from his shirt, and at the door were the widow McDowell and Thomas. All afternoon, Thomas watched the woodcarver work, and when it was time to leave, Jonathan said to Thomas,
I'm about ready to begin the last two figures, Mary and the baby. Can you tell me how your figures looked?
Oh, they were the most special of all, said Thomas. Jesus was smiling and reaching up to his mother, and Mary looked like she loved him very, very much.
Thank you, Thomas, said the woodcarver.
Tomorrow is Christmas. Is there any chance the figures will be ready? The widow McDowell asked.
They'll be ready when they're ready.
I understand, said the widow, and she handed Jonathan 2 packages. Merry Christmas, she said. Jonathan folded his arms across his chest.
I don't want any presents, he said harshly.
That is exactly why we're giving them to you, said the widow, and she put them down on the table and left. Jonathan sat down at the table. Slowly he opened the first package. Inside of it was the red scarf, the hand-knit, warm, bright red scarf that the widow had been knitting. He tied the scarf around his neck. The other package held a robin, a crudely carved pine robin. A smile twitched at the corner of Jonathan's mouth as he ran his fingers over the lopsided wings. He dusted the fireplace mantel with his sleeve and placed the robin exactly in the center so he could look at it from his chair. The woodcarver did not eat supper that day. Instead, he began to sketch the final figures, Mary and Jesus. He drew Mary, and then he wadded the sketch into a ball and tossed it to the floor. He drew the baby, and then he wadded the sketch into a ball and threw it onto the floor. He sketched again, and once more he crumpled up the paper, and soon there was a mountain of crumpled papers at his feet. He picked up a block of wood and tried to carve, but his knife would not do what he wanted it to do. So he hurled the chunk of wood into the fireplace and sat staring at the flames. When he heard the church bells announcing the midnight Christmas service, he got up. He slowly opened the drawer beneath the cupboard, the drawer that he had told the widow never to open. From it he took the cloth embroidered with lilies of the valley and daisies, and he took out a rough woolen shawl and a lace handkerchief. He took out a tiny white baby blanket and a little pair of blue socks, and he placed each piece gently on the floor. From the bottom of the drawer, he lifted out a picture frame, beautifully carved of deep brown chestnut wood. In the frame was a charcoal sketch of a woman sitting in a rocking chair holding a baby, and the baby's arms were reaching up and touching the woman's face, and the woman was looking down at the baby. Jonathan sat in the rocking chair and held the picture close to his chest, and he rocked slowly, and his eyes closed, and 2 tears trailed into his beard. When he finally took the picture to his workbench, he began to carve. His fingers worked quickly and surely, and he carved all through the night. The next day, there was a knock on the window of the McDowell's door, and when she opened it, there stood the woodcarver, his neck wrapped in the red scarf, holding a wooden box with straw. "Mr. Toomey," said the window, "what a surprise! Merry Christmas!"
"The figures are ready," he said, and he stepped inside.
From the box, Jonathan unpacked the 2 curly sheep, the happy sheep, because they were with Jesus. He unpacked a proud cow, an angel, a very important angel, with mighty wings stretching from its shoulders right down to the hem of its gown. He unpacked 3 wise men wearing the most wonderful robes, edged with fur and falling in rich folds. He unpacked a serious and caring Joseph, and he unpacked Mary, wearing a rough woolen shawl, looking down, loving her precious baby son. Jesus was smiling and reaching up to touch his mother's face. That day, Jonathan went to the Christmas service with the widow McDowell and Thomas. And that day, in the churchyard, the village children saw Jonathan throw back his head, showing his eyes as clear blue as the August sky, and he laughed. And no one ever called him Mr. Gloomy again. Merry Christmas.